Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty important, the relationship between clothing and sexual assault.
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is, yeah, and you've provided us with this fascinating article to really kick things off. It's actually written in Bengali. Can clothing cause rape? Doubt, movement for the liberation of thought. So let's jump into this.
I'm ready.
Okay, so like right off the bat, this article just cuts to the chase. It's like, boom, this myth that clothing, like a woman's clothing can excuse sexual assault. Let's just dismantle that.
Yeah, it doesn't waste any time. It uses some really interesting examples too. Like it gives you these two scenarios, right? One where you have revealing clothing and rape happens, and then another where there's revealing clothing but no rape.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, and it just highlights that clothing isn't the issue. The author's really clear about this. It's the rapist and only the rapist who's responsible.
It's like regardless of what the victim was wearing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which, sadly, it's so common for people to say things like, well, what was she wearing?
Oh, yeah.
Like as if that somehow changes things. And the article really digs into these harmful stereotypes, calling them rape myths.
Yeah. Essentially trying to shift the blame from the perpetrator to the victim.
Right. And it connects this to the whole concept of victim blaming, like this idea that somehow the survivor is responsible for the harm they've experienced.
Exactly. And the article is arguing that when we fixate on a woman's clothing, we're missing the point. We're letting the person who actually did this off the hook.
It's like we're looking for excuses instead of holding the person who actually committed the crime accountable.
Absolutely.
And to back this up, they actually bring in some research, which I thought was really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So they cite this 2010 study by Ashley Moore, which looked at the reasons why women wear revealing clothing.
Okay.
And the findings are kind of surprising. Most women do it because they just like the style or want to feel attractive. Not specifically to attract men, which is what a lot of people assume.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
That reminds me of that really powerful exhibit, What Were You Wearing? Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I have.
It's incredibly moving. They display clothing worn by survivors of sexual assault.
At the time of the assault.
Yeah, and it's just so powerful because you see this wide range of clothing, like everything from, like khakis and a dress shirt to a swimsuit.
Yeah.
Even an army combat uniform.
It really just drives the point home that it can literally happen to anyone.
It totally dismantles this myth that clothing plays a role.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us to this other point that the article makes about this disconnect between how men often perceive women's clothing versus a woman's actual intentions.
So it's like there's this whole misinterpretation happening based on assumptions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The article talks about this thing called attribution theory, which is basically how we try to make sense of other people's behavior. So when a man sees a woman in revealing clothing, he might assume she's trying to be provocative.
Right.
But that might not be her intention at all.
So basically like misreading the situation completely.
Totally. The article actually compares the statistics from Moore's research on men's assumptions about why women dress provocatively.
With the women's actual stated reasons.
Right. Over 50% of men assumed women were trying to get sexual attention, but only 5% of women actually said that was their reason.
Wow, big difference.
Yeah, a huge disconnect.
This whole thing is making me think about how much these assumptions and stereotypes are just so deeply ingrained,
Yeah, it really makes you think.
And the article even ties this into this theory of ambivalent sexism. Like it's saying that sexism isn't always this like blatant hostility. Sometimes it can actually be disguised as something seemingly positive, like this whole idea that women need to be protected.
Right.
But then how does that contribute to victim blaming?
Well, that whole protective attitude can actually reinforce traditional gender roles and put the burden of preventing assault on the woman.
It's almost like saying that if she hadn't dressed that way, maybe it wouldn't have happened.
Exactly. It's such a subtle but dangerous form of victim blaming.
And the article doesn't stop there. It also challenges this misconception that all rapists are mentally ill or psychopaths.
Right.
Instead, it points to research suggesting that most rapists are actually psychologically normal individuals. And even more disturbing is that a lot of victims actually know their attacker.
Yeah, which just shatters this whole stranger danger myth.
It makes it a lot harder to distance ourselves from the issue,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because then we have to face the fact that these perpetrators are often people we might actually know or interact with every day.
It kind of hits closer to home.
Yeah, it does.
And the article even quotes a few legal experts on this, like Stephen J. Morse, Bruce J. Winnick, and Catherine Baker.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, Morse actually debunks this idea that men can't control their urges.
Right.
And Baker really emphasizes how this myth of the crazy rapist makes it so much harder to address the issue.
It's like we're trying to explain away a really widespread problem
Exactly.
by saying it's just a few bad apples.
When in reality, it's something much bigger.
Right. And if rapists aren't seen as abnormal, then maybe sexual assault isn't some freak occurrence.
But a reflection of something wrong with our culture.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about this myth that clothing causes rape. We've started to unpack the dangers of victim blaming and even touched upon the psychology of the perpetrators. So where does the article go from here?
Well, it brings up this really interesting concept, right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA, and how it connects to victim blaming.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, RWA basically describes these attitudes that value things like obedience to authority, aggression towards those who are different,
Yeah.
and like a really strong adherence to traditional social norms.
So you're saying someone with very rigid ideas about how women should behave would be more likely to blame a victim for not conforming to those expectations.
Exactly. And research has actually linked RWA to people being more likely to endorse benevolent sexism and those rape myths we were talking about earlier.
So it's like these broader societal trends are actually influencing how people perceive and react to sexual assault.
It's all connected. It's a really fascinating and a little bit scary how deep this all goes.
It definitely feels like there's a lot more to unpack here.
There is. We've only just scratched the surface. Let's take a deeper dive into the rest of it after a quick break.
It's good.
You know, as we were going through all that before the break, I was really struck by how this article connects these like big societal trends, you know, like right-wing authoritarianism, to how individuals see and react to sexual assault.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It is. And it really shows how complex this issue is. And the article goes even deeper. It explores how objectification plays into all this.
Yeah.
Like, it argues that the real danger isn't a woman choosing to have a sexualized appearance, but how other people objectify her based on that.
Oh, that's an important distinction.
It is. It's not about telling women to cover up. It's about changing how society views and treats women's bodies.
Okay, so instead of controlling women's choices, the focus should be on promoting respect and consent.
Exactly. Yeah. The article talks about this difference between self-sexualization, where a woman chooses how she wants to present herself, versus objectification, where she's reduced to a sexual object by others.
And it's that objectification that can lead to sexual violence.
Exactly. And it's why we need to shift away from controlling women's bodies and focus on changing the culture that allows this objectification to happen in the first place.
That makes sense. So this brings us to another point the article makes. Clothing is never an indication of consent.
Never.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what someone is wearing. It never implies consent for any sexual contact.
So it goes back to respecting a woman's right to choose. She has the right to choose what she wears without it being misinterpreted.
Absolutely. And it's always the responsibility of the individual to get clear and enthusiastic consent before engaging in any sexual activity.
It's about respecting boundaries.
Yeah.
Not seeing clothing as some kind of communication.
Right. And, you know, the article brings up this interesting point about the language we use when we're talking about clothes.
Oh.
It challenges this idea of provocative clothing. It asks, provocative to who? And for what purpose?
Yeah, who gets to decide what's provocative? And how are those labels being used to blame victims?
Exactly. Like, we're trying to find some external reason for someone's behavior, instead of acknowledging that assault is about the perpetrator's choices and actions.
It's their lack of respect.
Yeah.
So basically, the article is saying that we need to stop focusing on what a victim was wearing and instead focus on what the perpetrator did.
Exactly. We have to hold people accountable for their choices.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. It makes you realize this isn't just about individual cases of assault, but about how society as a whole contributes to a culture where victim blaming happens way too often.
It is. And it shows just how much work we still have to do to create a world where everyone feels safe and respected.
Regardless of what they wear.
Exactly.
You know, one thing that's really stuck with me from this article is this idea of a rape space.
I know.
It's such a powerful term. The article uses it to describe how when we're constantly focusing on women's bodies and their clothing choices,
Right.
we're actually creating environments where sexual assault is more likely to occur, or at least more likely to be excused.
Yeah, it's like you're saying that men just can't control themselves, and it's up to women to prevent assault by dressing a certain way.
Exactly.
Which completely ignores the fact that men can and should make choices and respect boundaries no matter what a woman is wearing.
And it puts the responsibility in the wrong place. The blame shouldn't be on the victim. It should be on the person who chose to commit the assault.
Absolutely. And it's so disturbing to think that this kind of thinking actually contributes to creating these rape spaces.
It really is. This article is really a call to action for all of us to be more careful about the language we use and the assumptions we make,
Yeah.
even unintentionally, like how we might be contributing to this culture that minimizes or excuses sexual violence.
It's a good reminder to check ourselves and how we talk about these issues.
What I also found really interesting was how the article emphasizes the importance of education in combating victim blaming.
Oh, absolutely. We need to educate ourselves and others about consent, respect, and healthy relationships.
It's about fostering this culture where we all understand that clothing choices are never an invitation,
Right.
and that victims need to be supported and believed when they come forward.
This deep dive has really shown how deep-rooted these harmful attitudes are. It's not just about individual cases, but about changing the whole system.
Yeah, it's about how society as a whole contributes to this problem.
Yeah.
And it's made me realize just how much work we still need to do to create a world where everyone feels safe and respected no matter what.
Absolutely. Well said. I think this article has given us a lot to think about and a lot to work towards.
It definitely has. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.